Hi, and welcome to episode 63 of the Breaking Bio podcast. I'm Morgan Jackson, a PhD student at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada.
I am Stephen Hamlin, postdoc at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia.
Hi, I'm Tom Housley. I'm a PhD student at the University of Stirling in Scotland.
And today we're joined by Dr. Crystal Dilworth, who's a correspondent for Al Jazeera America, as well as a neuroscience and biochemist, from what I understand. Thanks for joining us today, Crystal. Do you want to tell everybody a little bit about yourself and your work?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I just completed my PhD in chemistry at, well, everyone's heard of Caltech, I guess, California Institute of Technology here in sunny Pasadena. And I've sort of moved into a career in science communications, and so I work on a television show called Techno, which airs on Al Jazeera American, and I'm super excited about all the new stuff I get to do now that I've graduated.
Well, to start off, congratulations.
Thank you.
On all of the associated things.
Mm-hmm.
So we can actually move directly into your SciComm stuff, because we have a real big interest on that in the podcast. How did you get hooked up with Al Jazeera? Like, how does that career path emerge? You know, because for people with PhDs, there's always the problem of alternative career paths. So we're always interested in hearing how these sorts of things arise.
Well, I'll give you the sort of silly answer, and then I'll answer your question for real. So I have an interesting path. I always take a very strange path to wherever I end up. So my silly answer to your question is, well, first off, you make an independent movie, act in it, and then make sure that that movie goes to all of the continents, including Antarctica, and then start traveling with your movie and doing Q&As after the movie and discussing things like graduate culture and what it's like to be in academia. Realize that you really like talking to people about the process of science, what it means to be a scientist, who can be a scientist. Give a TED Talk about stereotypes of women in the media, and then make friends with a lot of other well-known science communicators who work on television shows, and then meet their producers and get offered a job on TV.
Well, that's easy.
Yeah. It's really straightforward. Anyone can do it.
Well, I got stuck at the movie part. Apparently I have a face for radio. Well, so that is actually quite the chain. I mean,
yeah. But I think that PhD students that might not want to start with the making, hooking up with an internationally known webcomic, PhD comics, and then making a movie with them, start small, right? Start a Twitter account, start a blog, start talking to people about what you do, make a podcast, get your name out there, and really just start telling your story to anyone who will listen. Yes, at the beginning you will just be talking to people that already want to hear you talk, like your mom and your lab mates and your 4 friends. But eventually, if you have something interesting to say, and if you're talking about science, I'm biased enough to think that most science is interesting, all science is interesting if the story is told correctly, your audience will widen, and you'll start to develop exactly what your voice is. So beyond talking about your own personal experiences, developing your views into a unique voice out there in the SciComm community.
I think that's an excellent strategy, and one that I think is starting to catch on a lot more rapidly online. From what I can see, is these independent voices are trying to be new and fresh, and everybody's picking out their niches, and I think it's really good overall. So you brought it up, and we'll talk about it quickly. So the PhD Comics movie is really quite excellent.
Oh, thank you.
Congratulations on that, because I sat here and did my homework, and by doing my homework, I actually watched the movie this afternoon. I've been meaning to, so this was a good impetus to do it, and it was really good. It was great. The comics, I mean, I think every grad student who can speak English is watching and reading the comics on a weekly basis, and totally relating to absolutely every single one of them. So what was it like to embody one of these well-loved characters from PhD Comics?
I think it was really funny because, Alex Lockwood, who plays Cecilia in the movie, and our personalities are actually more, or at the time, were more like each other's characters. Like, I was a little bit more uptight, like trying to be the perfect graduate student like Cecilia, and Alex was a lot more social and a lot more outgoing, and she had much better work-life balance like going into the project. But I think that we learned something from playing the other character, that it was okay to kind of take on a little bit more of those traits and personalities. But it's really interesting, you know, when you take a bunch of type A students at a place like Caltech and you tell them, we're going to make a movie, they don't think that's crazy. They think, okay. So if you just don't tell a bunch of, you know, very focused graduate students they're not supposed to be able to make a movie, that's what happens. Grad students get together and they make a movie about graduate school for other graduate students to kind of share in that collective pain and you know, like as a group therapy project, as well as sort of a celebration of what it means to be in academia and focus on that. And it was such a great experience.
Did it feel weird playing a social science character as the molecular neuroscientist?
No, not really. I mean, that's how I got into neuroscience. I wanted to know what made people tick, and I was fascinated by their collective interactions, and I think I found neuroscience almost by accident. I got a little bit addicted to the organic chemistry crossover into my psychology classes, and I ended up following that path and accidentally found myself in a chemistry PhD. But I think that PhD comics is written by Jorge Cham. He's an engineer and a very technical person, so I think sometimes the view of the social sciences in the comic itself and even in the movie is somewhat humorous. We need to learn to maybe take that a little bit more seriously in general.
You think they don't get quite the representation they should?
It's not about representation, I think. It's about honoring the fact that they too follow a scientific process and a hypothesis-driven method, and they are actually scientists as well. Not all just guitar strumming hippies.
All of them. Why should we give them out any of our tax dollars?
Boo.
Stephen is the resident jerk if anybody's listening and hasn't figured that out, so you can direct the mail to him if you're a social scientist.
How did I get this title now? I went from grumpy cat to resident jerk?
It's a very short line between those two, I'm sorry.
So you started developing these interests during your PhD, I presume, these interests in psychom and sociological processes in science. Did your attitude shift during your PhD towards these things, or was it just a natural outgrowth of what you were doing?
That's a really interesting and very difficult question to answer. I mean, my involvement in the movie was kind of driven by my past secret life in performing arts. So when I moved to graduate school, it was actually from New York City, where I was working and training as a modern dancer. So you know, that's not the normal way people get to science grad school. And I kind of missed it. You know, when I started graduate school, I was going to be the best graduate student anybody had ever seen. I was going to eat, sleep, think, dream science. I wasn't going to have any extracurricular activities or friends or anything else. I was just going to work in the lab, and I was going to get my thesis project done. And that worked for about 2.5 years. And then I was ignoring all emails about auditions for any dance shows, any theater, anything. I was being excellent. And then, you know, you've been reading PhD comics for your entire scientific life, and an email comes in that Jorge Cham is making a movie at your school and really wants as many graduate students as want to participate. Oh, really? But, I'm supposed to be a perfect graduate student, but I want to do that. And, you know, I ended up making the decision last minute. I drove up, don't tell my advisor, by the way. I drove up from a scientific conference that was in San Diego back to Pasadena to make an audition for the movie one evening so that I could drive back down to San Diego, which is about 2.5, 3-hour drive between San Diego and Pasadena, so that I could be there at 8 a.m. the next morning to present my poster.
I I love it when the guests give us blackmail material.
Well, I've graduated now, so I don't feel like I'm really risking that much.
It's safe to spill the secrets then.
Mm-hmm.
That's awesome. So I think it's really interesting, and again, this is coming some of the information from your TED Talk, which you gave, and we'll link it on our website after the post. How you talked about how you went from dancing back into graduate school because you followed, this passion that you had, and then you get to graduate school and you find a new passion as you're going along, and now you're into the science communication and back almost towards the entertainment side. I mean, you're straddling the lines, it seems like, between those things.
Yeah, so, I call myself an edutainer.
Nice. That's an excellent title to have. So how was the response from the scientific community around you? Because you're at Caltech, it's a big deal. I'm sure your advisor and your prof was both supportive of it and I'm sure a little weary of it as well when you said, I'm going to kind of do both of these things here. What was that like to go through the rest of your grad school with?
I guess the external process and the internal process is a little bit different. My advisor was as supportive as he could possibly be. As a tenured faculty member at an institution that focuses only on academic research like Caltech, he was as supportive and as tolerant as he possibly could be. And that was something that had to be managed. When we shot the movie, for instance, it was shot only on the weekends because, graduate students have to be in lab. And I didn't tell my advisor that was happening until the day that the trailer was being released online. And I didn't want him to hear from somebody else that this had been happening. So I sent him an email explaining that I had been in this movie and that it was shot at Caltech, and here's the link to it. And he goes back and forth between being proud and embarrassed, I think, a little bit. But the hardest thing that I encountered was it's kind of and this is why I gave my TED Talk a prejudice about who scientists are supposed to be and how they're supposed to act. And my TED Talk was a lot about external ideas of who and what scientists should be. But it was actually stimulated more by my experiencing an internal. Scientists have certain ideas about who can be a scientist and what you have to be like in order to be accepted as a scientist. And I was, through my science communication work, starting to come in contact with those very rigid ideas on a regular basis. And I think it's challenging. I think when you tell people, when you're in a PhD program and people ask you, what are you going to do next? What kind of postdoc are you going to have? And you say, I don't know. I don't think I want to keep doing bench work. And they say, oh, are you going to go into industry? And you say, well, no, I'm not sure what I'm going to do, but I had this vague idea that I'd like to get paid to talk. They kind of like respond, they get very uncomfortable, and they respond with this like, talk? What are you doing here? Well then why would you be getting a science PhD? And it's like, well, because I like science and I like what I'm doing now, and I think later I would like to talk about it. So I've come to terms with it now, but there is a very, or at least I have encountered a very prejudiced sort of view of those of us that do communicate science in a formal way. How dare they waste their time and our money talking to people that aren't experts in the field? I don't understand it, but that seems to be a prevailing view.
Yeah. I'm actually interested in that because we haven't really had a lot of look back, I don't think, unless, Tom's hiding a deep, dark secret about his advisor beating him mercilessly. But, you hear horror stories of people who, they try to explore different career paths from a PhD, and then they receive all kinds of blowback and the sense of failure, that because you didn't become an ivory tower academic, you wasted your time. You should have never done this, and you're just dragging down science. Do you think this is an attitude that's starting to shift?
I think it's going to have to. I think with the differences in funding and priorities of the many governments that have programs that fund scientific research, that scientists are going to be forced to not only change their views about what it means to have a PhD, given that the number of professor positions are so small compared to the number of PhDs that we produce, but what responsibilities come with that degree. And I would like to believe that the burden of communication of what you do and why you do it beyond those that are also specialists in your field is going to be necessary. Certainly, it will be a necessary skill in order to continue to receive funding from sources that are supported by voters.
So, with your role at Al Jazeera, how are you finding working with the scientists that you get on to talk to about their work? Are you able to coax them into communicating their science well?
I think it's I love when we get to interview academic scientists on that show, and I love watching their change in attitude when they realize that I'm not just a journalist. They seem to they get so much more comfortable when they know they're speaking to someone that's going to understand them and what they're saying and be able to appreciate what they're saying. And I think, or I'd like to believe, that kind of helps us drag from them the information that we need to tell their story, because they're uncomfortable in front of a camera, but they're more comfortable with how the information is going to be received, and so they're more forthcoming with it. And I find that my job there, when I'm doing an interview, is sort of paraphrasing what they say. We use mechanical agitation to break up the cell walls, and I say, okay, so this is like putting tennis balls in a dryer with your down comforter, and they bang around and they break up the feathers in the down comforter, and this is basically what you're doing in that little tube. And they say, yes, I guess you could think about it that way. And then you can take it a step further and say, and that's because these are plant cells and they have cell walls and it's a little bit harder to break them up. Yes. Like just starting to kind of relate back to things that people that would be watching the TV show on the couch, might say, okay, I've put a down comforter in a dryer with tennis balls before. I know what that sounds like.
So becoming a science translator is kind of where you're at right now.
Yeah, and I love it.
Cool. That's awesome. So we had Phil Torres on the show a couple of months back, and it was just before he was about to start with Al Jazeera. So do you want to fill the audience in a little bit on what Techno is and how it's come together on Al Jazeera America?
Yeah, I mean, Techno is, in my non-biased opinion, the best science communication show on television, and let me tell you why. It's a show that tells science stories, but all of the correspondents, all 9 of us, are scientists or engineers or data analysts. I think we have one odd woman out, and that's Lindsay, but we're okay with her because she's a data analyst and a former operative for the CIA. So she's
you can't piss her off, essentially.
No, and she's a pretty sharp lady. But the rest of us, of the 9, only 3 are men, which, I mean, for me, with like women in science being one of my big kind of hot topics, that's amazing. And 2 of us women have PhDs, and 0 of the boys on the show have PhDs. So we go out and we look at stories that is new science or new technology that is starting to become commercialized or just starting to be applied to humans, and we talk about how humanity is going to be impacted by these new developments. And we get to ask the questions that we, the scientists, would ask if we found ourselves sitting next to, that specialist in a bar or on a plane, and get really excited about their work, and the camera just kind of happens to be there.
So, in the kind of stories that you're doing, I presume that they're fairly focused on applied research and things that are easy to explain a benefit to.
Yes and no. Some of the more challenging pieces that I've done was a designer drugs piece. So these are chemical compounds that are very similar to what we know as the illegal drug compounds like THC, cocaine, heroin, but they're not exactly the same, and so they're not illegal. They're different by a single functional group. They're still psychoactive. They act on the same receptors as these known illegal compounds do, but they're legal to sell and to manufacture because they are not those identified illegal compounds. And these are on the streets, and people are taking them, and they are dying or going crazy, or in some of the more publicized cases, eating people's faces. And, that's a concern. So we talk about the sociological concerns, we talk about the legal implications, and I get to make an attempt to explain how changing a single atom in a chemical compound is actually a really big deal, and not just legally.
But are you doing stories on things like, theoretical physics, or, But I'm just wondering if there's an audience for those sorts of more abstract scientific stories, the more blue sky stuff.
The difficult thing with things like theoretical physics is the visual component, right? And the amount of turnaround time that we have for those types of stories is not large. So if you need a lot of animation or something like that, then we would leave that type of science communication to Cosmos, or something that's dedicated to that format. We're looking for things that are impacting humans, that are relatable to people that are on the couch that they just might not know about, but that could be changing the way that they are experiencing their world in the next few years.
I won't hold my breath in the interview then. All right.
So it sounds like you guys aren't just like the on-screen personalities. It sounds like you guys are doing a lot of the back reporting, the back studying up on these things. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to catch it because I live in Canada and I don't get the channel. I would love to. But it sounds like
we should be getting it soon. We've been picked up by Al Jazeera English, so all English-speaking countries that have Al Jazeera should be able to get the show soon.
Sweet. As soon as that happens, I'm going to sit down and binge watch it because that's going to be great. But it sounds like you guys are doing a lot of the research for these programs yourself, which I think is maybe a little bit different than other science news websites or programs that people may be used to, is having the experts doing the researching and the on-screen appearances. What's that been like for you?
That's a lot of fun to be able to jump in, a producer. Let's use the designer drugs story as an example. So producers said, we're having a really hard time understanding this thing called mass spectrometry. We don't know what it is, but we think it's kind of cool and it's being used to look at drugs. And I just happened to be in the office, and I was like, I've done LCMS. And then there's it's high energy beam and particles and explosions, and it's really cool. And you're sorting fragments by size and charge, and this is really awesome. And so I get to talk with the producers about that and get them excited about the technology. And then when I find out what the story is, and they say, well, we're not really sure, but these compounds look similar, and one's illegal and the other one's not, and I'm not sure why. And I just happened to be working on the massive open online course that my boss and I were put on through Coursera. And I was on the right slide for heroin and the derivatives that are used to treat heroin overdose. And I just kind of turned the screen around. And I was like, you see the one in the middle? That's heroin. You see these two? You see how they look almost the same, but they're not the same? Those would be an example of legal compounds that would have similar action but aren't heroin. And they said, that's great. Would you like to work on us in developing this into a story? And I said, absolutely.
Serendipity for the win.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's great. We're not doing all of the production work, but we definitely do have more in-depth conversations with the producers that are assigned to the story about what we think is the most interesting in the science.
I want to just shift to a final topic for coming to the end here. But so you did a TED Talk, and I'm curious about the process of this, because TED Talks, they've acquired this mystique built up around them. And so how do you end up doing a TED Talk, and what is the process like?
So it's an audition process. I was doing a youth talk, so my audience was middle school and high school students, which is terrifying. I would argue that they are the worst and most harsh audience in the face of the planet. And my original audition was a panel of high school students just kind of sitting in a row, like, go ahead, make my day. And you go in and, you know, some people had a talk presented. I didn't. I just kind of wanted to talk to them, and I went into the audition and I said, hey, I'm a scientist, and I really want you guys to know these things about scientists and what it means to be a scientist. And I kind of want to share my own story about how completely crazy it was and how nobody would have thought I would have ever made it to graduate school, you know, just by watching the decisions that I made in my life. But I made it here, and I'm a scientist, and I'm going to go forward and do other cool things. And I want to be able to tell you and all of your friends about my experience, so maybe you can get something out of it. And then you get feedback, you know, from them. There's like, not really interesting, seemed condescending, you know, like all of this stuff. But the scores were good enough that they voted that I should be in the actual event. And I took all of that feedback and built it into the presentation that I ended up giving. But because it was a youth talk, I think the audition process was less stringent. But yeah, you have to get somebody interested in you enough that you make the audition and that you make it through that process, which for an actual TED event is no small matter.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your TED talk, and it was.
Well, thank you.
I guess it's good to see people challenging these stereotypes. But, you know, you're talking to the three of us who are white, nerdy males, so we probably don't really challenge these very much ourselves. But I wanted to ask you about one of your other projects that I found earlier on, which is the Fail Lab.
Oh yeah.
And, I watched what I think was the final episode of that, where you really concentrated on stretch receptors.
Yep. There was a lot of vomiting. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That was one of the best things I've ever seen.
I was so scared. I think if you saw, I spent the majority of the episode hiding behind the couch, just to, you know, behind everyone that would be projectile vomiting forward.
Whose idea was it to color code the milk?
Oh, that was the producers, for sure. Yeah, brilliant on their part, really. When the actresses showed up on set, they were handed, you know, multiple gallon jugs of milk that had food coloring dumped into it, and they just said, start drinking. So they wanted to make sure they had something, quote-unquote, awesome to film later on that afternoon. And I think they did. I think they got it. They got the shot.
So are you doing any more of those, or did that reach its peak with multiple projectile vomiting?
Not really sure that you can top multiple projectile vomiting, but that was a single season series. I think we had 12 episodes, and it was just so much fun because the filmmaker, he knew he wanted to do something about science with scientists, but he's not a scientist himself. So it was really interesting to kind of have those conversations about how he sees things as a creative person and different takes on science and how you can communicate it than someone that grew up with that scientific mentality would have. And it was a really fun collaboration.
Wow. Well, as you said, you can't top multiple projectile vomiting, so I think we'll probably just end this episode with that, and people can go and watch that right after this. So where can people follow along with your emerging career, Crystal, and follow along with all that needs to happen on Techno, and as well as all of your other various projects?
I mean, I pretty much live on Twitter, so I'm at PollyCrystalHD, because I think that scientists are multifaceted and that there are many me's, so there are polycrystals out there. Yes. And and I pretty much post, and I'll link to things like Techno and Fail Lab and all that other stuff. But Fail Lab lives on YouTube, so if you just search on YouTube for Fail Lab, you should get me. And yeah, that's about it.
And when can people check out Techno? When does it generally air?
So in the U.S., it is on Saturdays at 4:30 Pacific and 7:30 Eastern.
Awesome. Well, I hope everybody at home is going to be keeping an eye out for Techno as well as Fail Lab, and I'm going to have to go check that out now, so I know what my eating is going to entail. Thank you very much, Crystal, for joining us. Everybody who's listening at home, you guys can find us online at breakingbio.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at breakingbio, and we have a Facebook page which you can search for by looking for the Breaking Bio podcast. Again, thank Crystal for joining us, and hope everybody has a great week until we come back next week.